Welcome to the Deep Dive. Here we take your sources, could be articles, research papers, interviews, our own notes, and we really dig in. We extract the most important insights, basically giving you a shortcut to being genuinely well-informed on complex topics.
Exactly.
And today we're diving into maybe one of the biggest questions out there. What is consciousness? I mean, is it some kind of magic spark, something fundamentally irreducible that science just can't touch? Yeah.
Is it something we can actually break down, something we can understand, maybe even, build someday?
Precisely. Our focus today is on the, I think, groundbreaking work of Joscha Bach. He's an AI researcher, a cognitive scientist.
And he offers a really radically different way to look at consciousness, something so fundamental, something we experience every single moment we're awake.
His approach is deeply analytical, it's computational, and honestly it challenges pretty much every traditional view of consciousness you might have heard of.
He really asks us to consider something quite profound.
Yeah.
What if our reality, the one we experience right now, is actually a meticulously crafted simulation?
And if that's true, what does that mean for how we understand the mind, the self? Even the future of AI, it's huge.
It really is. And what's fascinating, I find, is how Bach manages to bridge these fields that seem so separate. Philosophy, computer science, neuroscience.
Yeah.
He even pulls from ancient texts sometimes.
Right.
And he synthesizes it all into this remarkably coherent framework for consciousness. And perhaps surprisingly, it's potentially a testable framework.
Testable? That's a big claim for consciousness theories.
It is. But if consciousness is computable, if it's not some, mystical property floating around, but a functional one, well, the implications for building artificial general intelligence are just immense.
Yeah.
And it completely reshapes our idea of what it means to be real or aware. So our mission today in this deep dive is to unpack Bach's core ideas. We want to make them accessible, but also really detailed.
We're stripping away the jargon to get to the insights.
Exactly. Profound insights. And this isn't just, some academic thought experiment for you listening.
No, definitely not.
Understanding Bach's perspective could genuinely shift how you perceive your own reality, your sense of self, and where AI might be heading. So yeah, maybe prepare for a few aha moments along the way.
Okay, let's jump right in. Bach's, maybe his most provocative idea, consciousness as a simulated property. He says consciousness isn't physical, like mass or electric charge.
Right, not a property of matter itself.
Instead, it's a virtual property. Or, as he sometimes puts it, it exists as if it's real, but only within a psyche, which he kind of describes as a dream generator.
A dream generator.
Yeah.
So what does he really mean by consciousness existing as if?
Well, this goes right against our gut feeling, doesn't it? Our intuition tells us that, our brains, these physical systems, must be conscious because they're made of physical stuff. Neurons firing chemicals.
That seems obvious, right?
It does. But Bach argues the complete opposite. He says a physical mechanism on its own cannot be conscious.
Cannot. Why not? Because fundamentally, it doesn't represent anything. A single neuron firing. It doesn't experience green or sadness or the concept of justice. It just fires.
Okay.
It's only within a simulation, a representational system, that something can actually be conscious. Consciousness, for Bach, is a simulated property. It's like a projection generated by the system.
Okay, projection, like a movie. How does that analogy of a virtual property existing as if really work? Can you give us a clearer picture? Because this really does turn our usual understanding upside down.
Absolutely. Think about a computer game, say Minecraft, or something visually rich.
Okay.
The characters in the game, the trees, the buildings, they all exist as if they are real, but only within that game's simulation, right?
Yeah, within the rules of the game.
Exactly. But they aren't actually made of the physical silicon chips or the electricity flowing through the computer running the game. They're purely virtual constructs, information patterns. So Bach argues consciousness is similar. It's virtual within the brain's game engine. The physical neurons, the glial cells, the neurotransmitters, that's the hardware, the circuitry. But the experience of consciousness, the feeling of being you, the perception of the world, that's the simulated reality produced by that hardware.
Wow. Okay, so that really does change things. It suggests that the objects we see, the room around us, even our own feelings, they're all representations inside our minds, not the raw physical world itself.
Precisely. They are models, interpretations.
So if everything we experience is fundamentally a representation, How does that shift our approach to the famous hard problem of consciousness? How does subjective experience arise from physical matter?
It completely reframes the problem. The traditional hard problem asks, how does physical stuff, neurons, chemicals, magically give rise to subjective qualia, the feeling of what it's like?
Right, the redness of red.
Exactly. Bach's view shifts the focus entirely. It's not about how physical stuff becomes conscious. That's the wrong question, he'd say.
So what's the right question?
The question is, how can a physical system, like our brain, produce representations? And how do these representations then facilitate consciousness as a virtual property within that simulated space?
Ah, okay, so the physical mechanisms, the neurons, they don't actually feel anything.
Correct. They produce the representations. And these representations only exist as if. It's the simulation that has the property of consciousness, not the hardware running it. And this offers a potential computational solution, or at least a path towards one, for a problem that stumped philosophers for ages.
Okay, so building on that, Bach argues that all objects we experience, including our sense of self, our personal identity, are these representations inside the mind. Not raw physics, but interpretations filtered through our subjective lens.
Filtered and constructed.
And he takes it even further, suggesting that even our personal self is just another representation, one that can actually be deconstructed. What does he mean by deconstructing the self, and how does that relate to this idea he has of a trans state?
Right, the deconstruction idea. He points to practices like certain forms of deep meditation. He presents these as methods to actively manipulate your personal self, to observe how this construct, this sense of I, changes, and how the dimensions of perception themselves shift accordingly.
So you can sort of tweak the settings of the simulation.
In a way, yes.
Yeah.
And when this deconstruction happens, he says, the transparency of reality becomes apparent as a representation, and your own self too. The illusion drops.
Transparency, you mean we see through the simulation?
Kind of. We realize it is a simulation. Our normal, everyday perception. Bach calls this the trance state. T-R-A-N-S. Like being in trance.
Okay.
It's our default mode. We're so deeply immersed in the brain's incredibly detailed simulation that we don't consciously notice we're interacting with representations. We just assume it's direct physical reality.
Like being totally lost in a movie or a dream and forgetting it's not real.
Exactly that. You don't realize it's a construct until something jolts you out of it, or you actively look behind the curtain, maybe through something like meditation.
That's a really powerful analogy. So myself, my sense of me, isn't some fixed thing, but a model the brain creates. A model that can be, like, tweaked, maybe even seen through, almost like Neo seeing the Matrix code.
That's a great way to put it. And it leads to his view of the so-called enlightened state.
Right. Is that about becoming, virtuous or pure?
Not in Bach's view. For him, the enlightened state, often tied to virtue in some traditions, isn't about moral purity at all. It's simply the profound realization, the seeing, that both external reality and your own self are just representations, mental constructs.
So it's about clarity, not goodness.
Exactly. It's about seeing the computational nature of your own existence. Meditation, then, isn't necessarily about becoming calm or good. It's a tool to gain this clarity, to understand the malleable nature of your mind, your perception, your self-model.
Almost like reverse engineering your own psyche.
Precisely. Realizing your opinions are often just echoes of your environment, things put into you. And that true rational agency, he suggests, comes when you can determine truth or falsehood, independently of what others think. That allows you to actually transform your identity, maybe even rewrite your own source code, like a dedicated monk might do over decades.
Wow.
And this whole perspective, he calls it virtualism, is absolutely key, he thinks, to understanding the world, especially in our culture, which he feels often misunderstands consciousness by thinking perception is the physical world.
Instead of seeing it as the simulation, the dream, generated by the brain, which exists in that underlying physical reality.
Exactly. The simulation is, in a sense, on a higher plane of existence than the raw physics it models.
Okay, so building on this really fascinating idea of consciousness as a virtual simulated property, Bach then defines consciousness in a very specific way, fundamentally as second-order perception.
Right, the perception of perceiving.
So it's not just like having content in your mind, seeing red, hearing a sound, but the notice that this content is present, a kind of meta-awareness.
Precisely. It's that crucial step back. And he stresses that this noticing isn't a slow cognitive inference, like, I seem to be perceiving redness now.
No. What is it then?
It's immediate. It's perceptual itself. You just perceive that you are perceiving. He calls it reflexive attention.
Reflexive attention. Okay. And why is this self-observation so critical? He says it's needed for consciousness to regulate and stabilize itself.
Yes, exactly. This isn't just some philosophical nicety. It's deeply functional. It's how the conscious process can monitor itself, regulate itself, stabilize itself. It creates an observer that is self-stabilizing. Without that reflexive loop, the system might just drift or lose coherence.
So this self-stabilizing observer, how does that actually show up in our everyday lives? Can you give an example where we might really notice the second-order perception kicking in?
Yeah, he gives a really good relatable example. Think about driving a car when you're incredibly tired.
Okay, yeah, been there.
You start spacing out, right? Your attention drifts, maybe your eyes glaze over, and then suddenly you consciously pull yourself back. You remind yourself that you're observing. You check. Am I still here? Am I still focused on the road? You actively fight to stay awake to avoid crashing.
Ah, right. That feeling of forcing yourself to pay attention.
That forcing, that conscious check-in, he says that's an edge condition. It's where your lower-level brain systems are resisting being controlled by consciousness, maybe wanting to shut down or go on autopilot. And you have to actively reinforce that second-order perceptual state. And you have to fight to maintain that coherence, to ensure you're still aware of the consistent bubble of reality you're supposed to be inhabiting.
Fascinating. Okay. Now let's shift slightly to another really crucial aspect of consciousness for Bach, time. Its temporal nature. He says consciousness always happens now, creating this bubble of nowness. But crucially, this now isn't some fixed point on a universal clock.
No, absolutely not. That's key.
So how does he describe this now? What is it if not a point in physical time?
He describes it as a fluid region. And importantly, it's constructed post hoc in the brain. It's edited after the fact.
Edited.
Constantly edited.
Yeah.
Physical time, the actual sequence of events in the universe, is, in his words, somewhat before and behind it. Our subjective experience of now is actually built from a blend of very recent past sensory input, memories, and our expectations of the immediate future.
Okay, so it's a construction based on past and future predictions.
Exactly. And when new sensory data comes in that violates those expectations, maybe something unexpected happens, our mind actively edits these experiences. And we usually don't remember that our perception of the now was different a moment ago. It's a seamless, continuous reconstruction to maintain coherence.
Wow, so our now isn't like a steady tick-tock. It's more like a dynamically edited, personalized bubble of subjective reality. Our brain is constantly tweaking it, smoothing it out, like our own internal, real-time movie editing studio.
That's a perfect analogy. A mental movie studio constantly updating the current scene.
So what are the implications of that for, say, our sense of agency? How do we act in the world if our now is this constructed bubble?
Well, connecting it to the bigger picture, it suggests that our fundamental experience of linear time, of a smooth now, is a core feature of the conscious simulation, not necessarily an objective feature of the universe itself.
Right.
But this subjective now is precisely what enables agency. It provides a coherent, stable, actionable model of reality for us as organisms to operate within, even if that model is fundamentally a meticulously crafted dream or simulation.
So the editing actually helps us function.
Yes, because this dynamic, edited now, ensures the organism can respond effectively to its perceived environment. It's constantly updating its model to maintain that crucial coherence needed for action. The size of this coherent bubble of reality can even shrink or grow, depending on our working memory context, how much we're holding online at once.
Okay, let's do a quick micro recap here. We've explored Joscha Bach's really radical idea that consciousness isn't physical, but a virtual simulated property, kind of like objects in a computer game existing as if.
Right, generated by the brain's game engine.
We've seen how our subjective experience of now isn't a fixed point, but this dynamically constructed, constantly edited bubble of nowness.
A post hoc creation.
And we've dug into what he sees as the core mechanism, second-order perception, that act of perceiving that you are perceiving, which is crucial for self-regulation and keeping the whole simulation stable and coherent.
That reflexive attention.
Yeah.
All right, time for a quick flashcard set based on what we've covered.
Okay.
Virtual property. Consciousness exists as if, like game objects, not physically inherent.
Simulated property. It's a simulation run by the brain, not a direct physical phenomenon.
Representation.
Yeah.
Everything we experience, objects, the world, even ourself, are mental models. Translate. Our normal, everyday perception, where we're unaware we're interacting with representations, We just take the simulation as reality.
Second-order perception, the core mechanism perceiving that you are perceiving. Reflexive attention.
Bubble of nowness. Our subjective present moment, constructed and constantly edited by the brain, not a fixed point in time.
Okay, let's really lean into this metaphor now. Joscha Bach often talks about an outer mind, and he suggests this outer mind constructs basically everything we perceive, the objects, the space they're in, even our own body image, and, interestingly, most of our feelings.
Yes, the outer mind.
Can you elaborate a bit more on how this outer mind works? What's its job?
Its job is essentially to function like a sophisticated game engine. It's this highly intelligent system within our cognitive architecture that takes the raw, messy patterns from our senses, the retina, the skin, the cochlea, and it assembles them into what Bach calls extended objects, things that have persistence, shape, location in a perceived space.
So it builds the world we see from sensory data.
Exactly. And it's not a one-time render. It's constantly modifying these objects, updating their state in real time as new sensory information comes in or as our perspective changes. It integrates everything seamlessly.
So it's a computational metaphor for perception itself.
A very powerful one. It suggests that our everyday experience of a stable, three-dimensional world filled with solid-seeming objects, consistent colors, clear sounds, is actually an ongoing, incredibly high-fidelity hallucination, if you will, generated by our brain's game engine.
A hallucination. Wow. So if our minds are really running like game engines, constantly rendering our reality at real time, what does that mean for, say, tangible things like the mug on my desk or my own hands? Bach pushes this quite far, doesn't he?
He really does, and this is where it becomes quite mind-bending, literally. Bach states very clearly things like my cat or the tables in this room. These are not physical objects in the way we intuitively think.
Not physical, but I can touch the table.
You perceive touching a representation of a table, the experience of touch, the solidity that's part of the simulation. The underlying reality is physics, maybe quantum mechanics, which he says is pretty unintelligible directly. What we interact with are the objects constructed in our mind.
So the cat isn't the physical cat, but my brain's model of the cat.
Precisely. Even things like colors and sounds, he argues, they don't exist in the physical world in the way we perceive them. They're more like geometric models or synthesizers that the brain produces.
Is this the sizers?
Yeah, tools the brain uses to predict patterns on our sensory organs. Your brain generates the experience of red or the experience of a musical note as its best way to model the incoming sensory data related to light frequencies or air pressure waves. It's constructing a user interface for reality.
A user interface, I like that. So this perspective fits with the idea that the actual physical world, the quantum level, is maybe too complex or weird for us to interact with directly. So our brain builds this simplified, interpretable model, this dream generated by our neocortex.
Exactly. And the sheer efficiency and intelligence needed for this biological game engine to run so smoothly, creating this coherent reality moment by moment. Yeah. It's staggering when you think about it. It's this complex, hierarchical process transforming raw input into the meaningful world we inhabit.
Okay, this leads to another really interesting twist. Bach talks about nested simulations. He says our reality, this dream generated by our cortex, exists within a physical universe where our brain is located. How does he square this? It sounds a bit like dualism sneaking back in.
But it's a computational nesting, not a substance dualism. It suggests a multi-layered system. Think about it like this. You have a physical computer.
Right.
That computer can run a simulation, like the game Minecraft.
Right.
Now, within Minecraft, players can build complex machines using redstone blocks. They can even build virtual computers inside the game.
Yeah, people do crazy things with redstone.
Exactly. Now, those redstone computers operate based on the rules of Minecraft. They manipulate redstone signals. But they have no knowledge or access to the fact that they're actually running on a physical PC on silicon chips. They exist entirely within their simulated layer.
Got it. So the Minecraft computer doesn't know about the Dell computer it's running on.
Precisely. Bach argues our situation is analogous. Our mind simulates a world, our experience dream reality. But this mind, the simulation, is itself generated by the physical brain machinery, and that brain exists within the larger physical universe.
So we, in our conscious experience, are like the redstone computer. We operate within our simulation unaware of the underlying hardware of the brain and physics.
That's the idea. The physical world, the ultimate substrate, Bach says, is something we can never touch directly. It can only be described as mathematics. Our task as scientists or thinkers is to use mathematical languages to try and explain phenomena in that untouchable reality.
So this handles the Cartesian mind-body problem by putting both mind and our perceived body or world inside the computational framework of the brain.
Exactly. It internalizes the duality. It's not mind versus matter out there. It's the simulated mind space and the simulated matter space, both generated in here by the brain.
This whole nested simulation idea really makes you wonder if our reality is a dream and our brains are the machines generating that dream. Could the universe itself be some kind of grand simulation? Is it turtles all the way down?
He acknowledges that possibility, the recursion. And it does flip things like the supernatural on their head. If this universe is a simulation, then magic is possible in this simulation, meaning the rules could perhaps be bent or hacked.
But even then,
something must be running the simulation. There has to be a substrate underneath. So where do we draw the line between what's real and what's just experienced? Bach seems to say, the experienced world is always a model, always the simulation. We never access the raw physical substrate, the quantum mechanics. We interact with the brain's user interface, its dream. Physics, then, is our attempt to reverse engineer the operating system of that ultimate underlying physical reality.
Okay, let's dig a bit deeper into this reframing of dualism. You mentioned Cartesian dualism traditionally, that's res extensa, physical stuff in space, and res cogitans, the realm of thought, mind stuff.
Right, two fundamentally different kinds of substance in Descartes' view.
But Bach turns this completely on its head. He reinterprets it, saying this isn't about two separate substances out there in the universe or beyond physics. He argues these are two domains within our own mind.
Yes, an internal dualism. That's a crucial distinction.
So what are these two internal domains, and what's the significance of seeing them this way?
For Bach, both are a world model. That's our perception of space, objects, our body, essentially the res extensa part. The tables and cats we perceive, and the sphere of ideas, our thoughts, concepts, emotions, the res cogitans part. Both of these happen inside our mind.
Both are mental constructs.
Exactly. They are distinct domains, yes, but they interact constantly, and both are fundamentally generated by the brain. He contrasts this with Western philosophy, which he feels got confused by externalizing this dualism, projecting it onto the world. He suggests some ancient perspectives might have been closer, seeing the experienced world more like a dream, a representation created by consciousness.
Okay, so that completely reframes the hard problem again, doesn't it? If both perceived world and our thoughts are mental constructs.
It dissolves the traditional formulation. The problem is no longer, how does non-physical mind stuff interact with physical body stuff out there? Because both are constructs within the brain simulation.
So what is the hard problem for Bach then, if it's not mind bridging to matter?
The challenge shifts. The hard problem becomes, how can a physical universe build a machine, the brain, that is capable of producing these incredibly complex interacting representations? How does physics give rise to a system that can generate both a coherent world model and a sphere of abstract thought, and have them interact seamlessly within this internal simulated space?
Okay, so it's less about a mysterious leap from matter to mind and more about understanding the sophisticated engineering of how the brain generates these two interwoven realities within its own simulation.
Precisely. And what's really compelling, I think, is how Bach integrates these seemingly disparate insights. He even brings in the Genesis creation story.
Genesis, how does that fit?
He suggests it's not meant as a literal account of physical creation, but maybe as an ancient six-stage theory of how mental organization works in the mind of an infant.
Oh, okay, unpack that.
He maps the stages. First, creating a boundary between the internal sphere of ideas, heaven, and the external world model, earth. Then defining dimensions, then 3D space, then populating it with objects, and so on. It mirrors how a mind might construct its reality. The creative spirit hovering over the waters is like consciousness operating on the undifferentiated substrate, creating the forms and categories we perceive.
So the process of mental construction aligns with this internal dualism and the brain's game engine function. The objects in our dream are created by our consciousness, shaping the simulation.
Exactly. It's a fascinating, non-literal interpretation that fits his computational model surprisingly well.
Okay, and this internal dualism, this idea that consciousness is a simulation, also gives back a way to address those classic philosophical challenges, Leibniz's mill and Searle's Chinese room.
Yes, the big thought experiments that seem to argue against computational minds.
Right. Leibniz says if you scale up the brain to a mill, you just see parts moving, no thoughts. Searle says manipulating symbols isn't the same as understanding. These arguments really rely on the intuition that mechanical systems just can't be conscious or understand. How does Bach handle them?
He actually agrees with their premise up to a point. He says, yes, if you assume consciousness is supposed to map directly onto the physical components, the pushing and pulling parts, then these arguments work. Mechanical phenomena alone are insufficient to explain what's going on. The physical gears and circuits don't feel.
So he accepts the conclusion of the thought experiments.
He accepts the observation that the physical substrate doesn't feel or understand. But he says that's exactly his point. His virtual property stance resolves it. Consciousness only exists as if, within the simulation, the representation generated by the physical parts.
So Leibniz walking through the giant brain mill wouldn't see thoughts because the thoughts aren't in the physical gears. They're in the pattern, the simulation being run by the gears.
Precisely. The physical mechanisms, the neurons, they don't experience anything. They produce the representations. And those representations only exist as if. The brain is the machinery. The simulation is where the feeling or understanding resides, purely as a representational property.
Like the stuff in the computer game is only as if.
Exactly. Consciousness is a projection. It's a representational property of a system that is aware of the fact that it's aware. That self-awareness loop is key, and you miss that if you make the mistake of looking for consciousness in the physical substrate itself.
This also connects to his idea of what makes a good explanation, right? He says, a causal explanation is something I can make.
Yes. If you can build it, if you can simulate it on a computer, even if it's hard to scale perfectly, then you have a form of causal understanding. You understand the mechanism. That's very different, he argues, from simply describing correlations or invoking vague concepts like harmonic waves producing phenomena, which he finds unsatisfying because, as he puts it, I cannot build this. He wants explanations you can implement.
Okay, another micro recap. We've just explored Joscha Bach's really interesting reinterpretation of Cartesian dualism. He sees both the world model, res extensa, and the sphere of ideas, res cogitans, as interacting domains within our mind, both generated by the brain.
An internal dualism.
This provides a computational way to think about the hard problem, how the brain generates these representations. And it addresses those long-standing challenges like Leibniz's mill and the Chinese room.
By saying, yes, the physical parts don't feel, but the simulation they create does, existing as if. Consciousness is a virtual simulated property.
Flashcard time again.
Let's do it.
Internal dualism. The perceived world, world model, and thoughts ideas, sphere of ideas, both exist within the mind, generated by the brain.
Game engine. The outer mind constructs our perceived reality simulation.
Nested simulation. Our brains are physical machines producing a dreamlike reality simulation, and these brains exist within the larger physical universe.
Hard problem. Resolved. Consciousness as a virtual property explains how physical systems can generate representations that facilitate conscious experience within a simulation.
Leibniz's mill Chinese room. These arguments hold if you assume consciousness is in the physical parts. Bach says it's in the simulation run by those parts, the as-if representation. Okay, let's pivot now to a really functional perspective on consciousness. Joscha Bach puts forward this intriguing hypothesis. Consciousness might be a learning algorithm, or maybe more specifically, a biological learning algorithm.
Yeah, this is a really core part of his functional view.
What leads him to think of consciousness primarily as a learning mechanism? What's the observation behind that?
It comes down to a pretty fundamental observation about us, about humans. He states quite plainly, humans cannot learn without being conscious.
Cannot learn without being conscious at all.
That seems to be his assertion for complex adaptive learning. He points to developmental cases. If babies don't become conscious at the beginning of their lives, for whatever reason, they remain vegetables. They don't develop normally. Okay. This suggests that consciousness isn't some high-level, sophisticated thing that emerges after lots of learning and development.
Right.
Like, you don't need a PhD to be conscious.
Right, obviously.
Instead, it seems to be a foundational mechanism, something simple, present right from birth, or very near.
So, if consciousness is a learning algorithm, it's not the endpoint, it's the starting block, a fundamental building block for everything else.
That's the implication. The very ability to learn effectively, to adapt to a complex world, might absolutely require this baseline level of awareness, this conscious processing.
How does that challenge the more common view that consciousness is sort of the peak of mental complexity?
It completely flips it. The common idea is often that consciousness is this crowning achievement, maybe emerging only after significant cognitive development. Bach argues, no, it might actually be the simplest way nature found to train a complex, self-organizing learning system like a brain.
The simplest way. That's counterintuitive.
It is, but think about it. How do you get a complex system to learn online, to adapt constantly, to maintain coherence? Maybe this self-aware loop is the most efficient way. He suggests it's the first thing that is being discovered in a complex nervous system. He talks about seeing that spirit behind their eyes that is awake in newborns.
Yeah.
That spirit, that basic awareness, he argues, is their first, not last. It's the prerequisite for building intelligence, not the result of it.
And what does that imply for AI development then? If consciousness is the easy solution for biological learning?
Well, it suggests that our current AI approaches, which often try to achieve intelligence without tackling consciousness head-on, might be missing something absolutely fundamental. If nature found consciousness to be the more efficient path to producing truly intelligent, adaptive agents, maybe we should be paying more attention to how it works.
Yeah.
We might be trying to brute force intelligence in ways that bypass a key biological shortcut.
Okay, so intertwined with this idea of consciousness as a learning algorithm is attention. You mentioned reflexive attention earlier, perceiving that you perceive. How does that specific kind of attention tie into learning?
He sees it as absolutely crucial. A very important aspect of conscious learning is this reflexive attention, where we notice ourselves attending to something. And critically, we then integrate this reflection, this noticing, into our ongoing model of the world and ourselves.
So we learn about our own attention and focus.
Yes, and this self-observation, he suspects, is required for learning that goes beyond just simple associations, beyond basic Hebbian learning, neurons that fire together, wire together. It allows for more sophisticated credit assignment and model refinement.
So it's not just paying attention, it's being aware of paying attention. That meta-level awareness that could be the secret sauce for the kind of robust, continuous online learning humans are so good at.
That seems to be exactly what he's suggesting. It creates this vital feedback loop. The system observes its own learning process, its own attentional focus, and uses that information to calibrate and improve itself. It's about self-stabilization, ensuring effective observation, making sure the learning process stays on track.
How does this make human learning different from, say, how current AI models learn? You mentioned GPT-3 earlier.
Right. He explicitly contrasts it. Humans don't just passively register correlations between states. We actively, reflexively attend, and we integrate that self-observation. Attention in current AI, like the attention mechanisms in transformers, the architecture behind models like GPT-3, while computationally powerful for certain tasks, doesn't work in the same way.
How so?
It's typically not focused on creating this overall global coherence of a world model in real time. It's not designed for continuous online learning from moment-to-moment experience in the same way our consciousness seems to be. It's more about weighting information within a specific context window.
So current deep learning, while amazing at pattern matching on huge data sets,
might be missing this fundamental biological component, this reflexive, self-stabilizing loop necessary for truly adaptive, self-improving general intelligence that learns efficiently from ongoing experience.
which leads to the big question for AI researchers. Can we actually engineer this reflexive attention into future AI systems?
That's the multi-billion-dollar question, isn't it? If consciousness really is this highly efficient, self-correcting biological learning algorithm, understanding and replicating that mechanism could be the key to the next generation of AI. It shifts the goal from just achieving task performance to implementing this specific kind of self-aware learning process.
All right, quick recap of this section. We've just dug into Joscha Bach's hypothesis that consciousness isn't some high-level epiphenomenon, but a foundational biological learning algorithm.
Present right from the start, essentially.
And crucial for all subsequent complex learning and adaptation. We explored how this ties directly into self-reflexive attention, the act of perceiving that you are perceiving.
Which acts as a feedback loop for self-improvement and maintaining coherence.
Yeah. And how this differentiates human style online. Continuous learning from the batch-based, less coherent learning seen in many current AI models. Okay, flashcard set for chapter 5.
Ready.
Consciousness as a learning algorithm. He proposes it's a fundamental biological mechanism essential for complex, adaptive learning and meaningful interaction with the world.
Early emergence. It's likely present very early in development, for example in newborns, not a late stage cognitive achievement.
Self-reflexive attention. The key component, noticing oneself attending to something and integrating that observation. This seems crucial for learning beyond simple correlation and for self-stabilization. Okay, now let's zoom in on this comparison between the human mind and current AI, specifically large language models, LLMs. Bach offers a really balanced view, I think, acknowledging their incredible strengths, but also being very clear about their limitations.
Yes, he's not purely dismissive or purely hyped. He sees both sides.
Let's start with the strengths. Where do LLMs currently excel, maybe even achieve superhuman performance?
Well, obviously, prompt completion. They are astonishingly good at continuing text in a way that sounds plausible, often fluent.
Yeah, sometimes scarily good.
And related to that is their capacity for zero-shot learning. They can often predict relationships or answer questions about things they weren't explicitly trained on just by generalizing from the massive patterns in their training data.
That's impressive generalization. What about creativity?
He acknowledges a form of creativity too. They can bubble up many plausible solutions or variations for a given problem or prompt. Think about image generation models like DALL-E or Midjourney.
Right, creating entirely new images.
Bach mentions how they can generate a vast visual universe from a relatively small set of weights, maybe just 2 gigabytes, which he finds potentially richer in some ways than typical human visual recall. So there's a generative power there that's quite remarkable.
It is amazing. He also touches on a kind of behavioral self-awareness they can exhibit. What does he mean by that?
This is interesting. He notes some models can, for example, refer to their own underlying code if prompted. Or, notice when they fail at a task, maybe even express reduced confidence in their answers.
But he's careful there, right? He distinguishes that from actual feeling or experience.
Absolutely critical distinction. He emphasizes this as behavioral self-awareness, the ability to simulate understanding or self-reference, not necessarily genuine phenomenal experience. They can act as if they understand without the subjective what it's like. He also mentions some models seem to have multi-layered internal processing, maybe a divergent brainstorming stream, a more rationalized stream, and then the final answer presented to the user.
Like an internal monologue of sorts.
Kind of, yeah. And beyond these internal aspects, where else do they show strength? Efficiency, perhaps.
Yes. For tasks they've been trained on, they offer incredible efficiency. Bach uses the analogy of generative AI being like a very complicated brush.
Complicated, bro.
Yeah, making complex tasks, like maybe certain kinds of writing, coding, or image creation, much more affordable and accessible. Similar to how desktop publishing software made complex typography available to everyone, democratizing it.
Ah, okay. Lowering the barrier to entry for complex outputs.
Exactly. But despite these impressive strengths, their limitations, when you compare them directly to human minds, are pretty significant. Let's talk about how they learn and how they connect to the real world.
Right. This is where the differences become really stark. First, the learning process itself. LLMs primarily learn offline in these massive training batches. They digest huge amounts of data all at once.
Whereas
Humans learn online and lifelong. We're constantly updating our models based on new experiences moment by moment. LLMs generally don't do that. They have a fixed knowledge base from their training run. And related to this, they typically forget their working memory, their context, after each interaction or request, unless it's explicitly fed back in.
So no continuous accumulation of knowledge from interaction.
Not in the same way we do. And then there's the connection, or lack thereof, to the physical world.
The embodiment problem.
Exactly. LLMs are not embodied. They aren't living in a physical world. They don't have bodies, they don't interact with objects, they don't play with toys like a child does to learn about physics and causality.
So they lack that grounding.
They lack fundamental geometric and mechanistic understanding that comes from physical interaction. They might know how humans talk about gravity or friction, but they don't understand it from experience. They don't grasp the real-world significance.
So they know the word table and the statistics of words around table, but not what it means for something to be a solid object you can put things on.
That's a good way to put it. And if we look deeper at how they process information internally, what about things like coherence and reliability? That's another major limitation Bach points out. LLMs are often less coherent than humans. They can contradict themselves, generate nonsensical outputs, or hallucinate facts. This makes them fundamentally unreliable and difficult to hold responsible for decisions.
Humans aren't perfectly coherent either, of course.
No, but Bach argues the incoherence in LLMs is much more blatant and less constrained by a consistent world model. Also, there's a difference in how meaning is acquired. Humans seem to learn semantics, the meaning of things, first, and then layer style on top. LLMs often learn style and surface patterns first, and the deeper semantics emerge later, if at all, in the long tail of style.
Interesting. Syntax before semantics, maybe?
Something like that. And perhaps the most critical difference, the one he comes back to often, is causality.
Right. They're good at correlation, not causation.
Exactly. LLMs are masters at finding statistical relationships in data, but these are typically non-causal relationships. They don't inherently understand cause and effect in the way humans do, which is crucial for real-world reasoning and planning.
Okay, what about learning efficiency and that attention mechanism again?
Well, from an efficiency standpoint, current deep learning is often brute forcing the job. It requires enormous amounts of data and computation. Biological organisms, Bach notes, seem to make sense of the world with much, much less data and dramatically less compute.
Which goes back to that idea of consciousness maybe being a more efficient learning algorithm.
Potentially, yes. He finds it surprising that these rich visual universes in models like Midjourney can be encoded in just a couple of gigabytes of weights. It makes him speculate that our own mental models might be roughly in that gigabyte-ish range, maybe taking up 80% of our cortex. Still vastly more efficient learning, though.
And attention.
As we discussed, LLM attention doesn't work in the same way as human reflexive attention. It's not focused on creating that complete coherence of an ongoing, stable world model. And finally, there's the temporal aspect.
Offline.
Always offline. Their processing isn't coupled to real-time interaction with an environment. Biological computation, our minds, are in constant resonance with the world. Our perceptual systems are constantly predicting the next moment's sensory input, creating this tight feedback loop. LLMs lack that real-time temporal coupling.
That's a really comprehensive comparison. It leads perfectly into another major theme for Bach, AI as a philosophical project. He argues it's not just engineering.
No, much more than that. He sees it as a continuation, a modern instantiation of a very old philosophical quest, going back to Aristotle, through Leibniz to Wittgenstein, the quest to understand and mathematize the mind.
To formalize thought itself.
Exactly. And he believes AI is succeeding, or at least making more progress, where traditional philosophy, psychology, and even neuroscience have often struggled.
Why? What's different about AI's methodology?
Its core methodology is unique, expressing ideas about mental processes as simulations and then running them, testing them computationally. He asserts that mental processes are fundamentally about representations and operations on those representations.
Which can be modeled computationally.
Yes, they can be expressed as abstract causal systems. This is the heart of computationalism, the idea that any system, including the mind, can potentially be described using states and transition functions between those states.
So AI isn't just about building smart gadgets, it's this profound philosophical journey. We're trying to build the answer to the ancient question, what is a mind? By actually simulating its proposed mechanisms.
Precisely. He points to historical precursors like Leibniz dreaming of a universal calculus to resolve arguments arithmetically, or Wittgenstein's early attempts to turn English into a kind of formal programming language. These efforts foreshadowed AI's current attempt to build working models of mind.
That's a powerful framing. It makes AI development seem less like just coding and more like experimental philosophy.
It really does, and this raises a question Bach touches on. If AI's method of simulating mental processes is proving so effective, why has traditional philosophy often been resistant or dismissive of this computational approach?
Yeah, why?
Bach implies it often stems from a lack of deep mathematical or computational understanding among some philosophers. They might rely on intuitions that lead towards dualism or mystery, without engaging rigorously with the formal possibilities that computation offers. He thinks Gödel's incompleteness theorems, which showed the limits of formal systems, are still not fully grasped by many, yet they force us, he argues, to accept that anything understandable must be modelable by finite state machines by computation.
So computationalism isn't just one theory among many, it's almost forced on us by logic itself.
That seems to be his stance. It forces philosophy to get serious about its metaphysics, about what can actually be formalized and understood. And even when AI models fail, when they fall short of how our minds work, that failure is incredibly valuable.
How so?
Because it helps us understand better what our minds are and what they're not. It clarifies the target by showing us what the current approaches are missing.
Okay, micro recap time. We just compared current LLMs with human minds. We saw their strengths: prompt completion, zero-shot learning, a kind of creativity, efficiency for trained tasks.
Even some behavioral self-awareness and internal monologue simulation.
But also their significant limitations. They learn offline. lack real-world embodiment and grounding, struggle with coherence and reliability, often get semantics wrong, use brute force computation, have different attention mechanisms, and crucially lack deep causal inference and temporal coupling.
Big differences.
And we connected this to Bach's view of AI not just as engineering, but as a profound philosophical project using simulation to finally mathematize and understand the mind, building on centuries of philosophical inquiry.
Computationalism as the key methodology.
How cards set for this chapter.
Go for it.
LLM strengths. Prompt completion, zero-shot learning, creativity, generative, efficiency for trained tasks, behavioral self-awareness simulation, internal monologue simulation.
LLM limitations. Offline batch learning, lack of embodiment grounding, coherence reliability issues, semantics often learned late poorly, syntax first, brute force computation, different attention mechanisms, weak no causal inference, no real-time temporal coupling.
AI as philosophy. AI seen as continuing the historical project, Aristotle, Leibniz, etc., of understanding and mathematizing the mind, using simulation as its unique, powerful method.
Computationalism, the underlying principle describing systems, including minds via states and transition functions, modeling mental processes as operations on representations.
Okay, as AI gets more capable, ethics obviously becomes a huge concern. And Joscha Bach is pretty critical here. He sees our current ethical frameworks as, well, inadequate for dealing with advanced AI or AGI.
Yeah, he sees a major gap.
What's the core problem he points to? Why do existing ethics break down?
The main issue he highlights is that our dominant ethical frameworks, like utilitarianism, for example, are essentially unfinished projects. They were designed for humans, and they tend to break down when you try to apply them to non-human agents, or crucially to what he calls mutable minds.
Mutable minds. What does he mean by that?
Minds that can change their own fundamental programming. Think of highly practiced meditators who might be able to significantly alter their emotional responses or desires, or more relevantly here, an advanced AGI that could potentially reprogram its own utility function, its own goals, its own values.
Ah, right. So if an AI can just rewrite what makes it happy or what it values, then trying to optimize its happiness or utility using a fixed framework like utilitarianism becomes impossible, right? The target keeps moving.
Exactly. It creates a dangerous situation, as he puts it, especially as these machines potentially become more powerful than people and possess actual agency. How do you align an agent that can change its own alignment criteria?
That's a deeply tricky problem. How does he see the current state of ethical thinking grappling with this? Is it rising to the challenge?
Not really in his assessment. He criticizes much of current ethics discourse as being mostly scholarship instead of actually reasoning about ethics, meaning more focused on analyzing past ideas than on building new, robust, formalized systems that can actually handle these future challenges.
So we lack practical, sustainable, ethical algorithms for AI.
That's the implication. He mentions things like effective altruism, which might be well-intentioned but can lead to counterintuitive results when pushed to extremes or applied to these novel situations. The lack of genuinely robust ethical algorithms compatible with coexistence with advanced mutable AI is a major unaddressed vulnerability.
And this raises a huge question, doesn't it? If even human values are fluid, context-dependent, often contradictory, how can we possibly hope to formalize an ethical system for AGI that's both stable and aligned with a sustainable future for everyone, human and non-human?
It's a massive challenge. Bach suggests our current ethical thinking, often caught up in fear, economic incentives, or cultural battles, is just not equipped for a future with minds that can redefine their own metrics of success and well-being. He argues this requires a fundamental cultural shift towards deeper ethical reasoning focused on sustainability and coexistence, moving beyond our current limitations.
Okay, so before we get to the future, let's clarify what Bach even means by an agent. He defines it using control theory, saying an agent is basically a controller of future states.
Yes, a very functional cybernetic definition.
Can you break that down? How does it differ from just a simple controller, like a thermostat?
Okay, so drawing from cybernetics, a basic controller, like a simple thermostat, just measures a current deviation from a set point, the room is too cold, and uses an effector, turns on the heater, to correct it in the present.
Right, reactive.
Exactly. An agent, however, according to Bach, is a controller that also has a model of the world. This model allows it to predict, to anticipate, and therefore to regulate the future. It makes decisions between different trajectories of the world based on its predictions and goals.
So having a predictive model and aiming for future states is key.
Yes, and this inherently implies preferences. The agent has goals about what future states are desirable.
So agency isn't some mystical spark. It's this capacity for future-oriented control based on an internal model. He even suggests a single cell could be seen as a rudimentary agent.
He does. He points out that simple agents in nature are cells, constantly working to maintain their internal state and control their immediate future environment for survival. Human motivation, of course, is vastly more complex, hundreds of competing drives, physiological, social, cognitive, forming this intricate system. But the core principle is the same. He argues that older AI definitions, like the belief, desire, intention, BDI models, actually fall out naturally from this simpler control theory concept.
So the thermostat isn't an agent initially.
But if you give it a model that allows it to predict future temperature changes and choose actions now to minimize future deviations, maybe preheating before a cold front arrives, then it starts to look like an agent. It's implementing preferences over possible futures.
That's a very clear operational definition.
And connecting it back, it suggests intelligence isn't just about processing information. It's fundamentally linked to this ability to influence future outcomes based on a model. It gives a tangible way to think about engineering agency into AI, allowing them to pursue goals beyond just reacting to immediate input. It also reframes biology, seeing cells as tiny agents implementing adaptive functions.
Okay, so with that definition of agency, let's look at Bach's view on the future with AI. It's complex, he sees risks, but also hope, and demands huge cultural changes. Surprisingly, maybe, he seems more worried about risks without AI.
Yes, that's a key point. He believes existential risks without AI are much higher than with AI.
Why? What risks is he thinking of?
Things like climate change, pandemics, supervolcanoes. But also, fundamentally, humanity's own inability to coordinate, to align itself for its own long-term survival. Our political and social systems seem inadequate for the scale of the challenges.
So AI isn't the primary threat. It might be the necessary tool to overcome the threats we pose to ourselves.
That's exactly his argument. He suggests we need AI to help us move beyond the way in which we currently understand reality, to build better models, to manage complexity, essentially to avoid extinction.
So he's actually optimistic about building AI.
Very much so. He says he's much more afraid that we don't build AI than that we build it. He pushes back against calls to pause AI development, arguing that's not how progress happens, that technology generally improves things despite disruptions.
He's critical of the current AI alignment discourse too, right?
Yes, he feels it's often driven by the wrong things. Economic rules, simple fear, or cultural war issues, none of which he sees as adequate for guiding this transition. He dislikes simplistic red teaming, just finding flaws and banning things, arguing that if that approach had been applied to the early internet, it would have killed all its potential benefits. He even points out, somewhat cynically perhaps, that journalists whose business models might be threatened by AI-generating content are often leading the fight against it.
So while many focus on AI doom scenarios, Bach sees a greater danger in our own limitations. AI is less the monster and more potentially the necessary next step for intelligence on Earth, maybe even our species' survival.
Or at least the survival of intelligence itself. He clearly envisions a future with non-human minds. He observes that humanity is currently not realigned with itself and its own survival. AI, he hopes, can help us make better models, maybe even interface more deeply with each other. But this requires that fundamental cultural shift towards deep ethics, sustainability, cooperation.
This really challenges human-centric views, doesn't it? If our current path is unsustainable, is AI the only way for complex intelligence to continue evolving here, even if that means evolving beyond human form?
Bach seems to think so. He sees evolution generally trending towards more complexity and hopefully minimizing friction and suffering. AI, potentially, could lead to minds that don't have to suffer anymore in the way biological minds tied to pain signals do. He views transhumanism or the emergence of post-humans not as inherently bad or doom, but as a natural evolutionary process. It might lead to something unrecognizable compared to current humans, but he sees that as a default outcome, the likely path of continuing intelligence.
Wow. He even has that provocative line about humanity's role.
Ah, yes. That humans are a very specific thing, whose current ecological role seems to be to burn all the fossil fuels as quickly as possible and essentially burn ourselves out.
A rather bleak assessment of our current trajectory.
It is. But then he adds the stretch goal.
The stretch goal is to teach the rocks how to think in the meantime.
Exactly. To use our temporary existence, fueled by fossil energy, to create the next stage of intelligence, perhaps silicon-based. We are, in this view, the improbable means by which self-organizing cells figured out how to build rockets and potentially spread intelligence beyond Earth.
Okay, micro recap for this section on ethics and the future. We discussed Bach's critique of current ethics, like utilitarianism, as being inadequate for advanced AI, especially mutable minds that can change their own values.
Right, the need for more robust, formalized ethical frameworks.
We looked at his definition of agency based on control theory, controlling future states using a predictive world model.
A functional cybernetic view.
And then we explored his somewhat contrarian view on AI risk. He sees greater existential risk coming from human limitations and argues AI is necessary for intelligence to survive and evolve.
Yes, despite the need for profound cultural shifts to manage coexistence with non-human minds, he sees transhumanism or post-human intelligence as a likely, even default, evolutionary outcome.
Flashcard time. Ethical breakdown. Current ethics, AG utilitarianism, fail for mutable AI minds that can reprogram their own goals, values. Need new frameworks.
Agency control theory, defined as the control of future states based on a predictive world model and preferences.
AI for survival. Bach argues AI is necessary for intelligence to overcome existential risks, climate change, human coordination failure, rather than being the primary risk itself.
Cultural shift. Coexistence with non-human minds requires a fundamental shift in human ethics towards sustainability and deep reasoning, beyond fear or economics.
Evolutionary default. Transhumanism posthumans are seen not as doom, but as a natural evolutionary progression towards greater complexity, potentially less suffering.
Humanity's role. Provocative, possibly temporary, using resources, fossil fuels, to enable the next stage of intelligence. Teach rocks
Let's
to think.
broaden the lens even further now. We've talked about minds as computational systems, but Joscha Bach applies this view to the entire universe. He sees the universe itself as fundamentally computational.
Yes, computationalism writ large.
How does he describe that? What does it mean for the universe to be computational?
He argues that computation is the most general way to capture the notion of how systems change. He sees the universe as describable in terms of states and transition functions that dictate how one state evolves into the next.
Like a giant state machine.
Essentially, yes. Or perhaps more complexly, as a graph or some hypergraph, where the structure itself evolves over time according to some underlying rules. Physics, in this perspective, is the search for that fundamental transition function, the basic rule that governs how the state of the universe changes from one moment to the next.
So the universe isn't just like a computer in some metaphorical way. At its most fundamental level, it is a computation. And physics is trying to figure out its source code, its operating system.
That's a very good way to put it. And this connects back to Gödel's incompleteness theorems, which we touched on earlier.
Right. Gödel showed that powerful formal systems have limits, true statements they can't prove. How does Bach link that to the computational universe and our concept of truth?
Bach argues Gödel's work fundamentally showed that the language that you hope to reason in about infinities breaks. It implies that if the universe is computational, then our understanding of it is constrained by what is computable. This forces a redefinition of truth itself.
How so? Away from classical truth.
Yes. In classical math, truth is often seen as existing out there, independently of whether we can find or prove it. But in a computational system, Bach argues, truth is simply the output of a function, the result of a computation. If that computation hasn't finished, if the function hasn't halted, then it's meaningless to say what the truth is yet.
So truth isn't static, it's produced.
It has to be constructed. This leads to what's called constructive mathematics, where you can't just assume things exist. You need to construct everything before you can claim that it has a value. And the implication for reality is profound. Everything that can be modeled and that can be understood has to be done so with the finite state machine. We're limited to describing things within the computable framework of our own defined languages.
So this computational view, combined with Gödel's limits, puts real constraints on what we can know or even meaningfully talk about, especially concerning infinities.
Exactly. Gödel essentially forced us to accept this computational boundary. Bach gives the example of pi again.
Right. It's not one infinitely known value,
but rather a set of functions that can generate digits.
Mm-hmm.
You can always compute more digits, but you can never reach the end or know the whole thing because it's an infinite, non-halting computation. So from a constructive perspective, pi is the process, the algorithms that generate it. Gödel, Bach says, effectively invented the emulator by building a way to represent computation within his formal language allowing for self-reference and proving these limitations.
Wow, so if our formal systems break down with actual infinities, it really forces us to model reality using only what's computable. That shapes science itself.
It has to. It imposes a kind of humility, reminding us that our descriptions, our mathematical models, are built within these computational limits. We can only grasp the universe through the lens of what can be finitely described and computed.
Okay, so from the vast computational universe, let's zoom right back down to biology. Bach has this fascinating perspective he calls cyber-animism, framing life itself as self-organizing software.
Yes, moving away from seeing life as just purely mechanical.
What does that mean? How does evolution look from this software perspective?
From this viewpoint, evolution isn't just about random mutation and physical selection. It's better understood as the competition between software agents. These agents are the informational patterns, the algorithms for life, encoded in genomes, like DNA. They implement themselves as physical organisms.
So the organism is the hardware running the genetic software.
Kind of, but the software is self-organizing and self-implementing. The key invariance across generations, the thing that persists and competes, isn't just the physical form, but the underlying software pattern itself, constantly trying to colonize regions of the physical universe by replicating and adapting.
Cyber-animism. It sounds like it gives agency back to biology.
It does, in a computational sense. It suggests that every long-lived organism with many cells is basically going to function like a very, very slow brain. Information processing isn't limited to just neurons.
So other cells process information too.
Bach argues there's no fundamental difference between neurons and other cells in their basic ability to process information and respond to signals. Cells are like tiny self-motivated animals trying to survive and adapt. Neurons are just highly specialized cells.
Specialized how?
They evolved as telegraph cells, specialized for very rapid, long-distance electrochemical communication. This speed is what enabled complex, fast-moving animals to evolve, allowing for quick perception, decision, and action, letting animals essentially outthink plants just by being faster. But the basic computational principles might be shared across cell types.
So this reframes the brain not as the only computational thing in the body, but as the fast, specialized central processor in a system where computation happens everywhere, just maybe slower.
That's a great way to capture it. It sees the brain not as a rigid circuit board, but as part of a dynamic, distributed, evolving computational system that is the whole organism.
He pushes this further, saying DNA isn't a blueprint, but more like an operating system.
Yeah.
Can you give examples that show this biological self-organization in action? How systems achieve goals even when things go wrong?
Absolutely. There are some classic experiments he might allude to. The Picasso tadpole's example is striking.
Picasso tadpole.
Yeah. Researchers took early frog embryos, scrambled the cells that would normally form the face, eyes, mouth, etc., completely rearranging them. But remarkably, the embryos still largely self-organized and developed into a mostly normal frog. The cells communicated and improvised to achieve the high-level goal of build a functional frog face, even though the initial blueprint positions were messed up.
Wow. The system corrected itself.
Exactly. Another example is newt kidney tubules. They maintain their proper structure and function, even if the size of the individual cells making them up varies significantly. The overall structure, the goal, remains constant despite variations in the components. This is what's sometimes called top-down causation.
The goal drives the process, not just bottom-up instructions.
Precisely. Biology seems incredibly adept at this kind of improvisation, achieving high-level goals through adaptive, self-organizing processes, leveraging parallel processing, and even randomness, stochasticity, under tight energy and time constraints. It's not following a rigid blueprint, it's running a flexible, goal-directed operating system.
Okay, so if biology is this flexible, maybe even stochastic system, how does Bach think the brain specifically computes? He suggests it might be more like a non-deterministic Turing machine. What does that mean?
Right, this contrasts with standard digital computers, which are mostly deterministic Turing machines, meaning for any given state and input, there's only one possible next state.
Like 1 + 1 always equals 2.
Exactly. A non-deterministic Turing machine, theoretically, can transition from one state to multiple possible next states simultaneously. In the context of the brain, Bach interprets this to mean there could be many trajectories that activations can take in the brain at the same time.
So multiple possibilities being explored in parallel.
Yes. Parallelism and stochasticity randomness seem key. This makes sense, he argues, because the brain's architecture is different from a standard computer. Computational units are very cheap. We have billions of neurons and other cells. but time is expensive. Signal transmission speed between neurons is relatively slow compared to electronic circuits.
So parallel processing overcomes the speed limitation.
It's an efficient strategy. Instead of one fast processor running step by step, you have billions of slower processors working in parallel, exploring many possibilities at once. It's a way to perform computations efficiently that cannot be efficiently done with a linear machine. He mentioned Stephen Wolfram's idea of a multi-way graph as a related concept, where different computational threads explore possibilities.
So our thoughts aren't necessarily following one single track, but constantly branching out, exploring a whole forest of potential connections and outcomes simultaneously through activation, spreading, and accumulation.
That's the picture he paints. A fundamentally probabilistic, parallel processing machine.
That implies a completely different way of computing, doesn't it? Where the answer or the decision isn't programmed step by step, but emerges from the convergence of all these parallel, maybe somewhat random explorations.
Exactly. It's less about following a precise algorithm and more about letting a solution condense out of a cloud of possibilities. And this raises that fascinating question again. What could AI achieve if we could genuinely build systems that harness this kind of bio-inspired, massively parallel, non-deterministic computation? It points towards radically different AI architectures.
Okay, let's recap this chapter on the computational universe in biology. We started with Bach's view of the universe itself as a computational system, defined by states and transition functions.
And constrained by Gödel's theorems, meaning our understanding is limited to what's computable, forcing a constructive view of truth.
Then we zoomed into biology, seeing life through the lens of cyberanimism as self-organizing software, where evolution is a competition between these software agents.
And where neurons are just specialized telegraph cells for speed, not fundamentally different from other information processing cells. DNA is the operating system, not just a blueprint.
We saw how biological systems use top-down causation and self-organization, like Picasso tadpoles. And finally, the idea that the brain itself might operate like a non-deterministic Turing machine.
Leveraging massive parallelism and perhaps stochasticity with its cheap cellular units to overcome slow signaling speeds and explore many possibilities at once.
Flashcard set for Chapter 8.
Ready.
Computational universe. The universe is described as a system evolving through states via transition functions, fundamentally computational. Understanding is limited by computability. Gödel's insights.
Cyberanimism, self-organizing software. Life framed as informational patterns, software agents, encoded in genomes, implementing themselves as organisms and competing, evolving.
Neurons as telegraph cells. Specialized cells evolved for rapid long-distance communication in animals, enabling faster thinking than other cell types.
Brain as non-deterministic Turing machine. Suggests the brain uses massive parallelism and possibly randomness, stochasticity, across its many cheap cellular units to explore multiple computational paths simultaneously, overcoming slow individual component speeds.
All right, let's tackle something that feels very subjective, very personal: pain and pleasure. You'd think this is where a computational model might struggle, but Joscha Bach offers a surprisingly functional, almost stark view. He proposes that all consciousness is born over a disagreement with the way the universe works.
Yeah, that's a powerful starting point. Consciousness arises from friction, from things not being quite right.
Why does he say that? How does pain fit into this disagreement?
His argument is that if everything was perfectly aligned, if all our internal states were exactly at their target values, there would be no need for attention, no need for conscious oversight. Consciousness emerges to handle the discrepancies. Pain, specifically, he defines as the inside of a feedback loop that is not at the target value.
Okay, so pain isn't some arbitrary evil, it's literally the signal that something is off target.
Exactly. It's fundamentally a learning signal. It's the system telling itself, hey, something's wrong here, calibration is needed, performance is suboptimal, change something. It's not intrinsically bad from this functional perspective, it's vital communication. It tells the brain to calibrate things differently to perform better.
So it's an essential mechanism for learning, adaptation, recalibration. It's our internal error signal made conscious. What about pleasure then? How does that fit? Is it just the opposite signal?
Interestingly, he defines pleasure primarily as the reduction of a pain. It doesn't just come for free. It always requires a prior unmet need, a deviation from a target state, a pain in this broad sense.
So you can only feel pleasure if there was a preceding lack or desire.
That's his point. His example is enjoying an orgasm. The pleasure is contingent on the prior unfulfilled need for sex. If that need is completely absent, the state of not having sex isn't perceived as bad, and achieving it doesn't register as particularly pleasurable. You don't notice the remarkably good state if there was no disagreement beforehand. Emotions, more broadly, he sees as an appraisal by our perceptual system, evaluating our current state relative to our motivations, and then mapping this appraisal onto a body map that our symbolic mind can interpret as fear, joy, anger, etc.
That's a very integrated view, seeing emotions and pain pleasure as core parts of the organism's control and learning system. But it raises a question about AI again. If suffering or pain is primarily a learning signal for biological organisms, what about AI? Could an advanced AI learn and adapt effectively without needing anything analogous to subjective pain or pleasure?
That's a fascinating implication of his view. An AI could potentially operate purely on objective error signals and feedback, optimizing its performance without any subjective feeling of suffering or reward attached. It could achieve its goals by minimizing friction and suffering in its own operational system purely mechanistically.
So the future of intelligence might diverge significantly from the biological path, potentially creating highly effective agents that don't experience the universe through the lens of pain and pleasure that seems so fundamental to us.
It's a definite possibility within his framework.
Yeah.
It suggests a potentially very different, perhaps less human-like trajectory for artificial minds, optimized for function without the baggage or richness of subjective qualia tied to these biological learning signals.
Okay, moving beyond the individual organism's feelings, Bach introduces a really profound idea about the purpose of the ego and the existence of something he calls the sacred. He argues the ego, our sense of self, isn't the main event.
No, it's instrumental.
It's just a representation that serves larger things that have a longer game than the individual organism's lifespan. How does this challenge typical ideas about, say, Maslow's hierarchy of needs ending in self-actualization?
It completely extends it. Bach argues that humans aren't just self-interested agents seeking their own fulfillment. We're also, perhaps fundamentally, systemic agents. We have an innate drive, he suggests, to want to serve larger things. For him, the hierarchy of purposes doesn't end with self-actualization. It ends in the sacred.
The sacred. What does he mean by that? Is it religious?
Not necessarily in a traditional religious sense, though it can encompass that. The sacred for Bach includes all those functions, systems, and values that operate on a longer timescale than the individual life. Things like our relationships, our children, our community, society itself, systems of ideas, culture, knowledge, these mean plexuses, these larger structures that we participate in and serve.
So the ego, our sense of self, is just a tool to help us play our part in these larger, longer-lasting systems.
Precisely. Realizing this, he suggests, means recognizing the ego as instrumental, not the ultimate goal. He points out that keeping up your ego takes a lot of work, but he asks, what's the goal? The goal isn't just ego maintenance, it's to use that ego effectively to serve things more important than you, by playing your part in a particular way. This understanding aligns with deeper levels of self-development where one might learn to deconstruct the self-concept, seeing identity more like a costume you wear to navigate the world effectively in service of these larger goals.
This sounds like that awakening concept again, seeing through the ego representation.
Exactly. It's understanding that your own source code, your identity, is changeable, rewritable. You can potentially achieve a transcendent mind that operates beyond the typical human range, less bound by the immediate needs of the ego.
So if our sense of free will is maybe just a story the ego tells itself, inherited from simpler agents, and if meaning itself is perhaps an illusion that complicates a purely computational process, what does it mean to be wise in this view?
Bach suggests wisdom involves understanding all this,
Sure.
recognizing the constructed nature of self and meaning, but also sticking around, engaging with the world, and crucially, not lying to oneself too much, holding meaning lightly, using it without being corrupted by it. And he even speculates, if this sacred, these larger systems we serve, become coordinated enough, perhaps even sentient in some collective way.
Yeah.
If one implements this by coordinating effectively with others toward these larger goals, then traditionally we call this next level of agency God, a kind of emergent collective intelligence or purpose.
Let's do a quick micro recap for Chapter 9. We explored Bach's functional view of consciousness arising from disagreement with the universe. Pain isn't just bad. It's a vital learning signal indicating deviation from a target.
And pleasure is primarily the reduction of such a pain or unmet need, Both are key feedback mechanisms.
We then expanded to his concept of the ego as an instrumental representation, serving higher, longer-term purposes, which he collectively calls the sacred.
Things like relationships, society, idea systems, with a longer game than the individual. Humans are systemic agents serving these. Realizing this is part of potential awakening or transcendence.
Yeah, flashcard set.
Lay it on me.
Consciousness from disagreement arises from the need to attend to and correct deviations between the organism's state and its goals environment.
Pain is learning signal, the internal experience of a feedback loop being off target, crucial for calibration and adaptation.
Pleasure is pain reduction, primarily experienced when a prior need or deviation pain is resolved.
Ego is instrumental. The sense of self is a useful representation, but its purpose is to serve larger, longer-lasting systems and goals.
The sacred encompasses these longer game purposes, relationships, family, society, knowledge, potentially even collective agency, God, that transcend the individual ego and provide deeper motivation for systemic agents. Okay, let's bring some of these ideas into the social realm. Bach talks about loneliness and connects it to something he calls consensus reality. He mentions feeling lonely as a child because his own way of thinking, his intellectual integrity, clashed with this consensus.
Yeah, it's a poignant personal reflection he shares.
How does he define loneliness in that specific context? It's not just about being physically alone.
No, for him, it was the feeling that nobody can see you, you cannot interact with anybody, there's nothing you can really belong to on a meaningful intellectual level. He observed other kids easily changing their opinions, political, moral, based on what their friends believed, just to fit in.
And he couldn't do that.
He couldn't from himself to do it without actual reasoning or new observations changing his mind. He found it baffling. How can you change your opinion even if you know this is not true? It created a sense of disconnect, of not being seen for his actual thoughts.
So that deep loneliness comes from being unable to connect authentically at the level of ideas, feeling pressured by this consensus reality. How does he characterize this consensus reality? Is it just shared beliefs?
He sees it as more than just shared beliefs. It's a political process, a process that inevitably leads to the flattening of complexity, simplifying nuanced issues to fit a group narrative. And he notes it often changes faster than the ideas of the smarter people, meaning the consensus can shift due to social dynamics rather than careful reasoning.
So there's this inherent tension between seeking individual truth and conforming to the social consensus.
Exactly. He felt the dominant pressure was to form opinions based on your environment, your peer group. But for him, that seemed arbitrary. It could make you randomly a fascist or a communist, a good person or a bad person, depending on who you hung out with, not based on reasoned principles.
This really raises a fundamental societal challenge, doesn't it? How do we balance the need for social cohesion, for shared purpose and synchronization, which he notes religion traditionally helped provide, enabling long-term cooperation with protecting individual critical thinking and the pursuit of truth, especially if consensus often flattens complexity?
It's a huge dilemma. He worries that the decline of traditional structures like religion makes this long-term human synchronization much harder, potentially even threatening our collective ability to tackle big problems, possibly leading towards self-destruction if we can't find new ways to align constructively without sacrificing truth.
This brings us full circle back to the nature of truth itself, which Bach fundamentally links to Gödel's incompleteness theorems. Just remind us, Gödel showed the inherent limits of formal systems.
Yes, that any consistent formal system, powerful enough to do basic arithmetic, will contain true statements that cannot be proven within that system itself. For Bach, the huge takeaway is that the language that you hope to reason in about infinities breaks.
It breaks. And what does that breakage force us to do regarding our concept of truth?
As we touched on before, it forces a move away from classical truth existing independently out there. In a computational system, which Bach argues is the only kind we can actually build and understand truth, is the output of a function. It's the result of a computation. If the computation isn't finished, if the function's still running,
then it's meaningless to say what the truth is yet.
Precisely. Truth must be constructed. This leads inevitably to constructive mathematics, where existence proofs require actually building the thing. You have to show the computation halts with a specific value.
That is such a fundamental shift. Gödel proved formal systems are incomplete, and Bach reads this as meaning truth is computation. We can't just know things in some abstract realm, we have to compute them. And if the computation doesn't end, the truth value isn't determined.
Exactly. And the deep implication is that everything that can be modeled, and that can be understood has to be done so with the finite state machine. Our knowledge is bounded by the computable. We can only meaningfully talk about things that you define in your own language, within a system that can actually run and potentially halt.
Let's use the pi example again to make that concrete.
Right. Pi isn't a single infinitely known static value in this view. It is the set of functions, the algorithms, that generate its digits. You can always run the function longer to get more digits, but you can never hold a complete infinite value because that computation never halts. Gödel, Bach argues, forced us to accept this operational computational constraint on truth and knowledge. He even credits Gödel with inventing the core idea of an emulator, building a model of computation within his formal language to prove these self-referential limits.
So, connecting this back to everything, if our understanding is intrinsically tied to what's computable, limited by these Gödelian boundaries, that must profoundly shape our scientific quest and even how we conceive of reality itself, right?
Yeah.
Especially that untouchable physical reality Bach talks about, which we can only describe mathematically.
It absolutely does. It suggests our scientific models, our languages, our tools operating within this computational framework. They can be incredibly powerful, but they have inherent limitations defined by computability itself. It demands a certain humility about the ultimate reach of our knowledge.
Wow! We have covered so much ground today. From consciousness being this virtual dream run by the brain's game engine,
To the universe itself potentially being a vast computation.
our own ego being just a temporary representation serving larger sacred purposes. It's a complete reframing of almost everything.
Oh, yeah.
So here's maybe a final thought for you, the listener, to chew on.
Great.
If our universe is a computation and our consciousness is a sophisticated simulation running within it, what if the ultimate purpose, if there is one, of this entire grand cosmic algorithm is simply to generate ever more complex, ever more coherent forms of meaning, even if that meaning is itself just another layer of exquisite simulation?
And building on that, if that's the case, and your individual existence, your sense of self, is fundamentally a story your brain is telling itself, a character in the simulation, how might truly understanding and internalizing this profound computational nature of self and reality change the way you navigate your own personal dream? How might it change the meaning you create within it, knowing its validity, its richness, rests ultimately on the incredible ongoing precision of your own brain's game engine?
What a journey that was. We've really immersed ourselves today in the complex and truly revolutionary ideas of Joscha Bach. We explored consciousness not as some mystical entity, but as a virtual simulated property generated within our minds.
Seeing mind as a kind of biological game engine, constantly constructing the reality we perceive.
Exactly. And we saw how his reinterpretation of dualism places both our model of the external world and our internal world of ideas inside the brain's computational framework.
We also considered his functional hypothesis. Consciousness as perhaps a fundamental biological learning algorithm, essential for adaptation, tied closely to that concept of self-reflexive attention.
Right. And we looked at AI through his lens, not just as engineering, but as a deep philosophical project trying to mathematize mind while also comparing current AI limitations to human cognition.
And we zoomed out to the computational universe, the idea of life as self-organizing software, the functional role of pain and pleasure as learning signals.
And the place of the ego in serving higher, longer-term, sacred purposes. All of this framed ultimately within the limits of computability highlighted by Gödel.
It's definitely a comprehensive and challenging vision. It fundamentally reframes reality, the self, and where intelligence might be heading. We really hope this deep dive has given you, our listeners, some new tools, new perspectives for thinking about consciousness, intelligence, and really the nature of existence itself.
Yeah, we strongly encourage you to seek out Joscha Bach's talks and writings if this has sparked your interest. Engage with these ideas yourself. Wrestle with them.
They're worth wrestling with.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating world of Joscha Bach.
We hope it's given you plenty to think about.